my friends. Welcome, welcome. Well, today I'd like to tell you a story of traveling trees. But to tell you that story, one must be a bit of a nut. And I, my friends, am a bit of a nut. My name is Henderson Luelling, and please forgive me. I haven't spoken a word since 1878, so it's always good to be out with anyone. Now, I was born in Iowa under Quaker parents. They raised me up on a farm, like most do in Iowa. And I grew up with a love of the land. I loved the soil and getting my hands dirty. And they pressed me on, Henderson, it's fine to be a farmer, but you could also go into law. You could be a preacher. But none of those things seemed to strike a chord with me, for I loved getting my hands dirty. So I grew up with a love of trees. The plants and the crops of the field were so ephemeral, but a tree was something I could plant and watch grow throughout my life and come back and check on it again. Fruit trees were my specialty. I'm a horticulturist. Now, my orchards in Iowa are very bountiful. You can still go visit them today. They are still there. But in the 1800s, in the 1840s, I started coming up with an idea. More and more people were fleeing across the border from the slave states, and my home became a stop on the Underground Railroad. Freed slaves or slaves running away, hoping for freedom, struck a chord with me. And I saw that people were starting to head out to a new land, the Oregon country, where everyone could be free, where answer to no man, where land was yours to be had, and rain fell from the sky, and my orchard would flourish there. So I hatched an idea. In 1846, I began building. Myself, my Wainwright, we got together, and I started building some wagons for a great journey. For the next year, my family of 7 children and my wife were going to head out across the great American desert, form a new life for ourselves in Oregon. Now, as we started building these wagons, that Wainwright, he started looking at them and said, "Henderson, what on earth are you doing?" For the wagons were much too long, and I had to procure more oxen and more oxen to pull such a heavy load as I was planning. And finally he figured out what I was going to do. My wagons were nearly twice as long, 2 of them were twice as long as a normal wagon. And what was I doing? Why, myself being a horticulturist, owning an orchard, I planned on taking my orchard to Oregon with me. Now, I must fill the back of these wagons up, made a customized wagon box, and filled them with dirt, wood ash, and manure, and seedlings. My little grafted seedlings I planted in rows. That's what I was going to carry with me to Oregon. And he would shake his head and say, Henderson, this will never make it. And I said, no, you just stay right here, mind the fields, and I will do what I do. So as the year passed on, and the winter came through, and spring came, and my wagons became ready to go, we loaded them up, my little seedlings. Now, to get a seedling to grow, I must tell you how they work. For the next time you have an apple, you go buy an apple from your market, cut it open, or eat it down to the core, and you take that little seed of that apple, whether it be a Golden Delicious, a Russet, Burbank, whatever it may be, plant it in the ground and see what grows, for a Honeycrisp shall not grow from that seed. You see, a wild, rangy thing shall grow with apples hardly edible. One must take cuttings off a tree, graft them to inferior rootstock in order to get that same apple. So the apples that you eat in your markets today, they come from a very, very long line of one apple tree. And that cutting keeps getting passed on and keeps getting passed on down. So there was a man before me named John Chapman who moved apples all over the Ohio River Valley. He sat there. You can imagine him sitting there. Of course, we call him John Chapman, is what I know him as. You probably know him better as Johnny Appleseed. He would sit there with his gunny sacks on and on a pile of seeds, and he planted them everywhere. For people wanted that land. They wanted those apples. But those apples weren't there to eat. An apple a day did not keep the doctor away. No one in my day began eating apples. You drank apples. You see, those little rangy, hard, inedible apples sat out, crushed, ground up, made a delicious cider. We did not have refrigeration in my day, and very quickly in the summertime, that cider began to ferment. And it was the only acceptable way to get pickled with a Parsons. For every Quaker of mine had a little bit of hard cider every day. And that kept us good and healthy. Now, when we started making cuttings and growing our apples and growing our pears off of that grafted rootstock, people started eating them because they tasted so much better than those little hard things that grow out there wild along the riverbanks. That's what I was going to take to Oregon with me, my orchard. So 1847 came, my 7 children, and my wife Elizabeth, who was just beginning to show the signs of early pregnancy, loaded up in 3 wagons. 1 wagon for my family and 2 wagons for my babies, my little darlings. 800 grafted seedlings planted in nice little rows. And we set off with 4 other Quaker families for the Oregon Territory. Now we crossed that wide Missouri and headed down the Platte River Road. Now, we were a bit slow because my wagons were very, very heavy. And so each day we would pull into our nooning spot along the Platte, and we'd be a little bit slower. And just as we were pulling in, the families would be finishing up their lunch and moving on. To go to camp that evening, we would be pulling in an hour or so after them, and the next day, maybe 2 hours. And before long, we were a half a day behind them. And the men of the wagon train, they came to me. They said, "Henderson, we fear that you are going too slow. These wagons are far too heavy. You must abandon these wagons. This is a fool's errand that you're on. After all, no one can take an orchard across this great wide country and plant it again and expect anything to grow." And I would hear none of it, for abandoning my orchard and abandoning my little darlings would be the same as abandoning my own arm or one of my own children. And that's something I simply just would not do. So I would hear none of it and continue on. A few days later, we were about 4 weeks into the trip. They approached me again, and they said, "Henderson, you've left us with no choice. Either you abandon these wagons, or we will abandon you." So I bid them fairly well, and off they went. I watched the dust as they gained distance, and never again did I see them again, for they traveled on. Then it was my family, our 7 children, and those 3 wagons that continued on. Now we were far from alone. One misconception you may have today is that we were alone out there on the prairie. Though there were very lonely stretches, the wagon trains would come up behind us, and they would pass us and see us as if we were in distress. And they'd come up and say, "How may we help you, dear sir? Your wagons are moving awfully slow." And then they would look around and see that our wagons were a bit odd and look to see what was in them. And then they would shake their heads again and go, "This man surely must be running a high fever." I once saw a woman come to my wife and said to her very quietly, just out of earsight, but I was still listening, she said, "My dear, when your husband dies, for surely he shall, head back to St. Louis. I have a sister there that runs a boarding house, and she'll put you up. Just tell her you know me, and get yourselves back on your feet, and perhaps you'll find a new husband, one that is not quite so odd as this one." Well, I, again, heard none of it, and every day the wagon trains would pass, and I'd see the men shaking their heads and the women wagging their fingers at me. But they would go on. "What a fool," they would say. "This man is surely going to perish." Well, many of you have heard the stories of the Oregon Trail, and you know about the Platte River and the quicksand and the little crossings that turn into very wide, mile-long quicksand sloughs. It's no different from my wagons, but we made it. My eldest boy, William, he would drive that one heaviest wagon, myself in the middle, and our wife driving the family wagon. We would push across that Platte River, and on we went. And the prairie thunderstorms would roll in, and they would lash us with rain and lightning, and we would continue on our slow, steady progress west. But it wasn't until we approached the South Pass of the Rocky Mountains. Now, those of you who have been across South Pass, you know it's nothing to really look at. You would never even know you've passed it. But there is a ridge before you get to South Pass called Rocky Ridge. That is quite an obstacle. Turned out to be one of the most fierce obstacles I would face. For Rocky Ridge lays bedding plains of soil, barely a hair's breadth thick. Nothing would grow there, just rock on plains. And to go up that, one must take their wagon and traverse across that rocky area and then turn sharp, traverse again. And you see we're just south of the Wind River Mountains, which seemed to be the source of many a prairie thunderstorms, came rolling out of those high peaks to lash us with its rain. Wagon trains have the advantage because many men can turn a wagon on a dime, whereas me and my children, we couldn't get those heavy wagons turned, so we had to make a very circuitous route up and around, very precarious turns that nearly tipped the wagons over. And you see a storm came rolling out of those Wind River Mountains that day, and I watched it build with intense fury. One that I had not quite seen this before. It was black, turning the sky even to a dark green color. Now we were traversing up Rocky Ridge as best we could. The family wagon had made its way over the ridge and down the other side, and my heavy wagon and William's were making its way along. I got mine up and over just as the storm unleashed itself on us. Lightning began streaking across the sky, and thunderbolts crashed all around, and we were in a hurry. The oxen pulling those wagons began a fearful bucking and kicking and trying to get out of their reins, anything they could do to get away from this terrible storm. It was now unleashing itself on us. Well, I finally got that wagon across and came back to help William get his. And at the time I saw that his lead oxen was very spooked and barely able to contain himself. And just at the time we narrowly got that oxen unhitched, a lightning bolt struck very near to that wagon. And when it did, it sent a panic into the team. And they panicked and they broke their reins. And I heard the sound of wood splintering. And I looked back just in time to see that great wagon tipping over and the rear wheel explode in a shower of splinters. I reached and I grabbed William and pulled him free from where that wagon tipped over. And as it tipped, all the soil and the dirt and that black, beautiful, organic matter from Iowa spilled all over that rocky ridge. I could see the little seedlings washing down in rivules down that rocky, barren plain. And I reached down and I grabbed them and I picked them up, my little wine saps, my little golden pear mains. And I could see it, the little roots bare, and it was lost. And the rain kept driving, and the hail began pounding down. And I grabbed my boy, and we grabbed what oxen we could, and we made ourselves down to the other side of Rocky Ridge and abandoned that wagon, shattered there on the rocks. And I got down to camp that night, and just like every other storm, this one abated, cleared off to a nice, brilliant, beautiful starlit night, and sat there very glum, for half my orchard was destroyed. I looked at Elizabeth and noticed she was now becoming even greater with child, and looked at my other children, cold and wet, sitting there, and I thought to myself, Henderson, you're such a fool. Why would you ever think that you could bring your orchard all the way across? You've nearly gotten us killed, just like everyone said they would. And I looked at my wife Elizabeth and said, my darling, let's abandon this last wagon and take our family. We know how to farm. We can push a plow. We still have oxen. Let's make our way over to our new home in Oregon and forget this fool's errand. And she looked at me and said, Henderson, what has happened to you? You must be running a fever. Would you abandon your own orchard here? This is what you do for a living. We've made it this far. We've crossed the continent. We're headed down. You must continue on with this. This is your dream. And she was right. And so the next morning dawned bright and clear and hot. And we loaded those two wagons. And we began on, pressing forward. But our adventure wasn't done there. For later that same day, I saw in the heat of the day dust rising on the horizon. And as it rose, it got closer, and I noticed that dust was being kicked up by horses. And these horses had riders, and those riders were headed towards us. And as they rode towards us, I could see the feathers in their hair and the paint on their bodies. And it was a war party come riding out of the mountains to see our lone two wagons, and they came riding right towards us. Now, being a pacifist, I have no guns. I have nothing to even butcher meat with, for we're all vegetarians in my family. So I walked out with my arms open. And if you should ever find yourself facing a war party, find the one with the most feathers. That's the one in charge. So I approached that one. He spoke no English, but he did call for someone else. The riders circled around us. They began looking through our wagons and seeing what we had. And unable to converse with him, he finally called up what must have been a half-breed, and he came up to me and spoke a little broken English. And they began looking through, and then a great commotion broke out near my very large dirt-filled wagon. And they all rode around to see what was the matter, and they looked in there, they conversed amongst themselves, and the chief and the translator came to me, and to come to find out, After seeing what we were carrying and all those people saying, "What a fool," well, this person, this man, this chief, he saw me as a medicine man. For I must be doing great medicine. I am taking trees across mountains. And who before me has ever done such a thing? I must be on a mission from the Great Spirit. And you know what? I think I was. For from that point on, they saw it so important that we make it to our destination in Oregon that we had an escort. They followed us, right along with us, as we rode along. Now we were still very slow, and wagon trains continued to pass. But no more did we hear any shaking fingers and wagging. No. They stayed very far distance from us and our companions. But we made our way through. We crossed right through at the base of this hill here and got our view of the Blue Mountains and our first green valleys of the Grand Ronde. And at that point, my wife looked at me and said, "Henderson, it's time." And I said, "My dear, time for what?" She said, "Number 8. Well, we dare not have a child out here in the barren, rocky slopes along the Blue Mountains. So our escorts, seeing this, their women got together and spirited her on, rowed her down to the Columbia, got her on a birch bark canoe, and floated her down to the Dalles of the Columbia River ahead of us, where she gave birth to my 8th child, a little girl, my little Spitfire. We named her Oregon Columbia Luelling. Well, and I finally made it to her. We were very, very happy to make it there, for we had one obstacle to pass now, and that was to float down the rapids of the Columbia before we could call ourselves home. But our friends still stayed with us, those that had met us all the way in the rocky areas of Wyoming now. We pulled out a flatboat that was halfway submerged along the banks of the Columbia, and they repaired it, and we got it together, put our 2 wagons on there, and they acted as guides and got us all the way down to Oregon City. But there was no time to waste. As soon as we got to Oregon City, I found a luscious clump of trees and began taking out my axes and saws, and my children and I began clearing land and planting my orchard. 350 grafted seedlings had survived. Within a year, that orchard was planted and growing, for in the Oregon country, the rain falls, and the temperatures are mild, and fruit grows. Apple trees by the dozens. And within 2 years, I was able to take some small cuttings and began selling those trees. $1 for currants and grapes, and $1.50 for apples and cherries and pears. Before long, I'd made quite a bit. And a few years later, my brother came out, started another orchard near us, and our seedlings began to spread, and fruit began to grow all over the valley. Well, a few years after I got there, a great discovery was made in the California areas, places along the American River, and it was gold. Now thinking to myself, those miners, all those young men coming out there, you would see them, their teeth falling out of their head. They lacked in essential vitamins and minerals that my fruit could provide. So I loaded that wagon up one more time with grafted seedlings, and we moved to California. And from there we began another orchard, which flourished as well as the ones in Oregon. Well, people would go on to say, of all the gold in the fields and the hills and the rivers of California and Oregon, no one pulled more gold out of those hills that could ever match that one wagon. And it's probably true. For you see, today, even today, you can go and try some of my fruit. It still grows. I told you, those cuttings, they're not replicated. You take one cutting from one tree, that tree grows mature, you take another cutting off of that one, and on it goes, just like our families. Everything grows, one generation to the next. And I'll tell you one today, one that's very popular. Come springtime, you should go to your local market. You'll see the lights shining down on them. Little baskets. Head there, there's these dark, nearly black crimson cherries. Take those little cherries, try one of them. Look for the name of them. For in an orchard, one of my orchards here outside of what is now Milwaukee, there was a row, and one tree on that row grew a spectacularly beautiful cherry. And we were wondering what to name this cherry tree. So my brother and Seth and I got together and said, "Seth, who's the foreman of that row?" And he said, "Well, it's a Chinaman named Bing. Let's name it the Bing cherry." You can still try them. If you head to Oregon, sometimes you can even still see some of my old trees from that very first cuttings. They still grow there today. But you see, friends, My time today is growing short. But I want to finish this up, and I want to tell you something, though. You see, I brought that wagon across the Great Plains, across the great American desert, and on in. And it wasn't fruit trees that I was carrying. Sure, that's what was in the cargo, but it wasn't fruit trees only. It was a dream, an idea. And perhaps you have a dream. You have an idea, just like mine. Some of you keep it very close to your heart. You don't want to let it go. You want to hold it right there. I have a little piece of advice for you. Take that dream out. Take that idea out. Give it a little sunlight. Put it in a little fertilizer. Watch it grow. But remember, it's not just sun and soil that cause you to grow. It is the storms that bring the rain. And we weather them, and we grow strong because of them. And maybe, just perhaps maybe, that idea of yours that you keep very close to your heart, perhaps that is the next $1 million wagon. Thank you, my friends.